The wisdom of the Jewish scriptures is certainly more than a human endowment, and even, as it would seem, more than an attribute of God. It may naturally remind us of the archetypal ideas of Plato, but the resemblance is scarcely more than superficial. The wisdom is hinted at in the book of Job. In a well-known passage of majestic beauty, Job replies to his own question, "Where shall the wisdom be found?" He represents wisdom as it exists in God and as it is communicated in the highest form to man. In God, the wisdom is that eternal thought in which the divine architect ever beheld his future creation. In man, wisdom is seen in moral growth. It is the fear of the Lord and to depart from evil. The wisdom is here only revealed as underlying, on the one side, the laws of the physical universe, on the other, those of man's moral nature. Certainly, as yet, wisdom is not in any way represented as personal. But we make a great step in passing to the book of Proverbs. In the book of Proverbs, the wisdom is co-eternal with Jehovah. Wisdom assists him in the work of creation. Wisdom reigns, as one specially honored, in the palace of the King of Heaven. Wisdom is the adequate object of the eternal joy of God. God possesses wisdom. Wisdom delights in God. Jehovah, says wisdom, possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting. From the beginning, or ever the earth was, when there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills was I brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the depth, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he gave to the sea his decree, that the waters should not pass his commandment, when he appointed the foundations of the earth, then I was by him, as one brought up with him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the habitable part of his earth, and my delights were with the sons of men. Are we listening to the language of a real person, or only of a poetic personification? A group of critics defends each hypothesis, and those who maintain the latter point to the picture of folly in the succeeding chapter. But may not a study of that picture lead to a very opposite conclusion? Folly is there no mere abstraction. She is a sinful woman of impure life, whose guests are in the depths of hell. The work of folly is the very work of the evil one, the real antagonist of the divine Kochma. Folly is the principle of absolute unwisdom, of consummate moral evil. Folly, by the force of the antithesis, enhances our impression that the wisdom is personal. The Arians understood the word which is rendered possessed in our English Bible to mean created, and they thus degraded the wisdom to the level of a creature. But they did not doubt that this created wisdom was a real being or person. As Kuhn summarily observes, das war überhaupt nicht die Frage im christlichen Altertum, ob hier von einem Wesen die Rede sei, das wir allgemein anerkannt, sondern von welcher Art in welchem Verhältnis zu Gott es gedacht sei, from Dogmatic. Modern critics know that if we are to be guided by a clear, certain sense of the Hebrew root, we shall read possessed and not created. And they admit without difficulty that the wisdom is uncreated by and co-eternal with the Lord Jehovah. But they resolve wisdom into an impersonal and abstract idea or quality. The true interpretation is probably related to these opposite mistakes, as was the faith of the Church to the conflicting theories of the Arians and the Sabellians. Each error contributes something to the cause of truth. The more ancient may teach us that the wisdom is personal, the more modern that it is uncreated and co-eternal with God. But even if it should be thought that the personified idea of the mind of God in creation, rather than the presence of a distinct hypostasis, is all that can with certainty be discovered in the text of the book of Proverbs, yet no one looking to the contents of those sacred sapiential books which lie outside the precincts of the Hebrew canon can well doubt that something more had been inferred by the most active religious thought in the Jewish church. The son of Sirach, for instance, opens his great treatise with a dissertation on the source of wisdom. Wisdom is from all eternity with God. Wisdom proceeds from God before any finite thing, and is poured out upon all his works. But wisdom, thus created from the beginning before the world, and having an unfailing existence, is bidden by God to make her dwelling in Jacob and her inheritance in Israel. Wisdom is thus the prolific mother of all forms of moral beauty. She is given to all of God's true children, but she is specially resident in the holy law, which Moses commanded for an heritage unto the congregations of Jacob. In that beautiful chapter which contains this passage, wisdom is conceived of as all-operative, yet as limited by nothing, as a physical, yet also as a spiritual power, as eternal, and yet having definite relations to time, above all, as perpetually extending the range of her fruitful self-manifestation. Not to dwell upon language to the same effect in Baruch, we may observe that in the Book of Wisdom, the Sophia is more distinctly personal. If this book is less prominently theocratic than Ecclesiasticus, it is even more explicit as to the supreme dignity of wisdom, as seen in its unique relation to God. Wisdom is a pure stream flowing from the glory of the Almighty. Wisdom is that spotless mirror which reflects the operations of God and upon which he gazes as he works. Wisdom is the brightness of the everlasting light. Wisdom is the very image of the goodness of God. Material symbols are unequal to doing justice to so spiritual an essence. Wisdom is more beautiful than the sun, and above all the order of the stars, being compared with the light she is found before it. Wisdom is more moving than any motion. She passeth and goeth through all things by reason of her pureness. Her sphere is not merely Palestine, but the world. Not this or that age, but the history of humanity. All that is good and true in human thought is due to her. In all ages, entering into holy souls, she maketh them friends of God and prophets. Is there not here, in an Alexandrian dress, a precious and vital truth sufficiently familiar to believing Christians? Do we not already seem to catch the accents of those weighty formulae by which apostles will presently define the pre-existent glory of their majestic Lord. Yet are we not steadily continuing, with no very considerable measure of expansion, in that very line of sacred thought, to which the patient servant of God in the desert and the wisest of kings in Jerusalem have already and so authoritatively introduced us? The doctrine may be traced at a stage beyond in the writings of Philo Judaeus. We at once observe that its form is altered. Instead of the wisdom or Sophia, we have the Logos or word. Philo indeed might have justified the change of phraseology by an appeal even to the Hebrew scriptures. In the Hebrew books, the word of Jehovah manifests the energy of God. He creates the heavens. He governs the world. Accordingly, among the Palestinian Jews, the Chaldee paraphrasts almost always represent God as acting not immediately, but through the mediation of the memra or word. In the Greek Sapiential books, the word is apparently identical with the wisdom, but the wisdom is always prominent. The word is rarely mentioned. Yet the Logos of Ecclesiasticus is the organ of creation, while in the Book of Wisdom, the Logos is clearly personified and is a minister of the divine judgment. In Philo, however, the Sophia falls into the background, and the Logos is the symbol of the general doctrine, for other reasons perhaps, but mainly as a natural result of Philo's profound sympathy with Stoic and Platonic thought. If the Book of Wisdom adopts Platonic phraseology, its fundamental ideas are continuous with those of the Hebrew scriptures. Philo, on the contrary, is a hearty Platonist. His Platonism enters into the very marrow of his thought. It is true that in Philo, Platonism and the Jewish revelation are made to converge, but the process of their attempted assimilation is an awkward and violent one, and it involves the great Alexandrian in much involuntary self-contradiction. Philo, indeed, is in perpetual embarrassment between the pressure of his intellectual Hellenic instincts on the one side and the dictates of his religious conscience as a Jewish believer on the other. He constantly abandons himself to the currents of Greek thought around him, and then he endeavours to set himself right with the Creed of Sinai by throwing his Greek ideas into Jewish forms. If his Logos is apparently moulded after the pattern of the nous basilikos en te to dios phusei, the regal principle of intelligence in the nature of Zeus, with which we meet in the Philebus of Plato, Philo doubtless would fain be translating and explaining the Dabar Yahweh of the Hebrew canon in perfect loyalty to the faith of Israel. The Logos of Philo evidently presupposes the Platonic doctrine of ideas, but then with Philo, these ideas are something more than the models after which creation is fashioned, or than the seals which are impressed upon concrete forms of existence. The ideas of Philo are energizing powers or causes whereby God carries out his plan of creation. Of these energetic forces, the Logos, according to Philo, is the compendium, the concentration. Philo's Logos is a necessary complement of his philosophical doctrine concerning God. Philo, indeed, as a devout Jew, believes in God as a personal being, who has constant and certain dealings with mankind. Philo, in his Greek moods, conceives of God not merely as a single simple essence, but as beyond personality, beyond any definite form of existence, infinitely distant from all relations to created life, incapable of any contact even with a spiritual creation, subtilized into an abstraction altogether transcending the most abstract conceptions of impersonal being. It might even seem as if Philo had chosen for his master not Plato, the theologian of the Timaeus, but Plato, the pure dialectician of the Republic. But how is such an abstract God as this to be also the creator and the providence of the Hebrew Bible? Certainly, according to Philo, matter existed before creation. But how did God mold matter into created forms of life? This, Philo will reply, was the work of the Logos, that is to say, of the ideas collectively. The Philonian Logos is the idea of ideas. He is the shadow of God, by which, as by an instrument, he made the worlds. He is himself the intelligible or ideal world, the archetypal type of all creation. The Logos of Philo is the most ancient and most general of created things. He is the eternal image of God. He is the band whereby all things are held together. He fills all things. He sustains all things. Through the Logos, God, the abstract, the intangible, the inaccessible God, deals with the world of men. Thus the Logos is mediator as well as creator. He is a high priest and intercessor with God. He interprets God to man. He is an ambassador from heaven. He is the God of imperfect men who cannot ascend by an ecstatic intuition to a knowledge of the supreme God. He is thus the nutriment of human souls and a source of spiritual delights. The Logos is the eldest angel or the archangel. He is God's eldest, his firstborn son. And we almost seem to touch upon the apprehension of that sublime, that very highest form of communicated life, which is exclusive of the ideas of inferiority and of time, and which was afterwards so happily and authoritatively expressed by the doctrinal formula of an eternal generation. But as we listen, we ask ourselves one capital and inevitable question. Is Philo's Logos a personal being, or is he after all a pure abstraction? Philo is silent, for on such a point as this, the Greek and the Jew in him are hopelessly at issue. Philo's whole system and drift of thought must have inclined him to personify the Logos. But was the personified Logos to be a second God, or was he to be nothing more than a created angel? If the latter, then he would lose all those lofty prerogatives and characteristics which, platonically speaking, as well as for the purposes of mediation and creation, were so entirely essential to him. If the former, then Philo must break with the very first article of the Mosaic Creed. He must renounce his monotheism. Confronted with this difficulty, the Alexandrian wavers in piteous indecision. He really recoils before it. In one passage, indeed, he even goes so far as to call the Logos a second God, and he is accordingly ranked by Petavius among the forerunners of Arius. But on the whole, he appears to fall back upon a position which, however fatal to the completeness of his system, yet has the recommendation of relieving him from an overwhelming difficulty. After all that he has said, his Logos is really resolved into a mere group of divine ideas, into a purely impersonal quality included in the divine being. That advance toward the recognition of a real hypostasis, so steady as it seemed, so promising, so fruitful, is but a play upon language, or an intellectual field sport, or at best the effort which precedes, or the mask which covers, a speculative failure. We were tempted perchance for a moment to believe that we were listening to the Master from whom apostles were presently to draw their inspirations. But in truth we have before us in Philo Judaeus only a thoughtful, not insincere, but half-heathenized believer in the revelation of Sinai, groping in a twilight which he has made darker by his Hellenic tastes, after a truth which was only to be disclosed in its fullness by another revelation, the revelation of Pentecost. This hesitation as to the capital question of the personality of the Logos would alone suffice to establish a fundamental difference between the vacillating, tentative speculation of the Alexandrian and the clear, compact, majestic doctrine concerning our Lord's pre-existent Godhead, which meets us under a somewhat similar phraseological form in the pages of the New Testament. When it is assumed that the Logos of St. John is but a reproduction of the Logos of Philo the Jew, this assumption overlooks fundamental discrepancies of thought and rests its case upon occasional coincidences of language. For besides the contrast between the abstract ideal Logos of Philo and the concrete personal Logos of the fourth evangelist, which has already been noticed, there are even deeper differences which would have made it impossible that an apostle should have sat in spirit as a pupil at the feet of the Alexandrian, or that he should have allowed himself to breathe the same general religious atmosphere. Philo is everywhere too little alive to the presence and to the consequences of moral evil. The history of Israel, instead of displaying a long, earnest struggle between the goodness of God and the wickedness of men, interests Philo only as a complex allegory, which, by a versatile exposition, may be made to illustrate various ontological problems. The priesthood and the sacrificial system, instead of pointing to man's profound need of pardon and expiation, are resolved by him into the symbols of certain cosmical facts or theosophic theories. Philo therefore scarcely hints at the Messiah, although he says much concerning Jewish expectations of a brighter future. He knows no means of reconciliation, of redemption. He sees not the need of them. According to Philo, salvation is to be worked out by a perpetual speculation upon the eternal order of things, and asceticism is of value in assisting man to ascend into an ecstatic philosophical reverie. The profound opposition between such a view of man's moral state and that stern appeal to the humbling realities of human life, which is inseparable from the teaching of Christ and his apostles, would alone have made it improbable that the writers of the New Testament are under serious intellectual obligations to Philo. Unless the preaching, which could rouse the conscience to a keen, agonizing sense of guilt, is in harmony with a lassitude which ignores the moral misery that is in the world, unless the proclamation of an atoning victim crucified for the sins of men be reconcilable with an indifference to the existence of any true expiation for sin whatever, it will not be easy to believe that Philo is the real author of the creed of Christendom. And this moral discrepancy does but tally with a like doctrinal antagonism. According to Philo, the divinity cannot touch that which is material. How can Philo, then, have been the teacher of an apostle whose whole teaching expands the truth that the Word, himself essentially divine, was made flesh and dwelt among us? Philo's real spiritual progeny must be sought elsewhere. Philo's method of interpretation may have passed into the Church. He is quoted by Clement and by Origen often and respectfully. Yet Philo's doctrine, it has been well observed, if naturally developed, would have led to Docetism rather than to Christianity. And we trace its influence in forms of theosophic Gnosticism, which only agree in substituting the wildest license of the metaphysical fancy for simple submission to that historical fact of the incarnation of God, which is the basis of the gospel. But if Philo was not St. John's master, it is probable that his writings, or rather the general theosophic movement of which they are the most representative sample, may have supplied some contemporary heresies with their stock of metaphysical material, and in this way may have determined by an indirect antagonism the providential form of St. John's doctrine. Nor can the general positive value of Philo's labours be mistaken if he is viewed apart from the use that modern skepticism has attempted to make of particular speculations to which he gave such shape and impulse. In making a way for some leading currents of Greek thought into the heart of the Jewish revelation, hitherto well nigh altogether closed to it, Philo was not indeed teaching positive truth, but he was breaking down some intellectual barriers against its reception in the most thoughtful portion of the human family. In Philo, Greek philosophy almost stood at the door of the Catholic Church, but it was Greek philosophy endeavouring to base itself, however precariously, upon the authority of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Logos of Philo, though a shifting and incomplete speculation, may well have settled as a guide to thoughtful minds from that region of unsettled inquiry that surrounds the Platonic doctrine of a divine reason to the clear and strong faith which welcomes the full gospel revelation of the Word made flesh. Philo's Logos, while embodying elements foreign to the Hebrew Scriptures, is nevertheless in a direct line of descent from the inspired doctrine of the wisdom in the book of Proverbs. And it thus illustrates the comprehensive vigour of the Jewish revelation, which could countenance and direct, if it could not absolutely satisfy, those fitful guesses at and gropings after truth which were current in heathendom. If Philo could never have created the Christian doctrine which has been so freely ascribed to him, he could do much, however unconsciously, to prepare the soil of Alexandrian thought for its reception. And from this point of view, his Logos must appear as of considerably higher importance than the parallel speculations as to the Memra, the Shekinah, the doctrine of the hidden and the revealed God, which in that and later ages belonged to the tradition of Palestinian Judaism. Providence, says the accurate Neander, had so ordered it that in the intellectual world in which Christianity made its first appearance, many ideas should be in circulation, which at least seemed to be closely related to it, and in which Christianity could find a point of connection with external thought on which to base the doctrine of a God revealed in Christ. Of these ideas we may well believe that the most generally diffused and the most instrumental was the Logos of Alexandria, if not the exact Logos of Philo.